Coach Mo.
Hey, it's Coach Mo.
Hey, it's Coach Mo.
Knowing what you want to accomplish professionally is just the beginning. I'm Coach Mo, and this podcast is for young professionals and emerging leaders who want to lead, achieve, and succeed at work. You've got executive ambitions and the drive to get there. Join me for perspective, insights, and thought-provoking questions that only you can answer. Today's episode starts now.
Tuesdays with Coach Mo.
They have worked hard to get the education. They have developed the skills. They've even played by the rules in their pursuits of fulfilling their executive ambitions, all in an effort to create a full, rich life for themselves and their families while doing work that mattered. The they I am referring to are the many high-achieving women, people of color, and LGBTQ people I have supported in my 10 plus years as an executive coach. You see, many of my clients have come face to face with the reality that their ladder is extremely narrow, fragile, and likely to crack under the weight of the inequities and bias within the corporate structure. Their years of tireless work have placed them on a ladder that is somewhat different than the ones being climbed by a majority of their peers. The promise of growth and advancement my clients observed on the overproduced websites and recruiting materials of the companies they chose to work for actually are a bit different once they're hired and have an opportunity to work for the organization and attempt to make the climb. My guest on today's podcast is Dr. Tim Ewing, who's currently the Vice President of Employee Diversity, Inclusion, and Experience at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. What you're about to enjoy is an interview I conducted with Dr. Ewing a few years ago when he was president and founder of Breakthrough Dynamics, a global diversity and organizational development consulting firm, where he helped large corporations in strategically planning and advancing their programs for diversity and inclusion. What is striking to me is how relevant his insights and perspectives are to us today, which is the reason behind my adding this to your Tuesdays with Coach Mo podcast series. Our current climate finds corporations out front in their acknowledgement that there is inequity within their structure and throughout corporate America. Large sums of money are even being shifted to support initiatives and institutions like Black Lives Matter. Today, the volume has been turned up as there is now the space for Black employees to share their stories of injustice and experiences of microaggressions in their personal and professional lives. What you're about to hear are specifics on the opportunity for organizations, teams, and professionals to achieve workplace effectiveness by creating an environment that functions and supports all employees. Of particular note during this conversation are Dr. Ewing's remarks on the unwritten rules of advancement for those of diverse populations. Enjoy the interview.
Diversity is important. Organizations are committed to diversity, but I'm hoping that today the audience will be able to take away how this relates to them as leaders in their respective organizations. Would you please define for us, Tim, diversity? How do you approach that term and its meaning with your clients?
Sure, thank you. So diversity, of course, I think is very expansive, and I think each organizational system oftentimes defines it for themselves. So the basic definition that I hold is unique characteristics that define us as individuals, and that can range from one's social identity to their tenure in an organization to things that are of value to them. I think what makes it unique to individuals or organizations are those differences that make a difference to the organization as well. So as we know, in many cases, gender and racial, ethnic minorities within organizations are oftentimes labeled as the diverse candidates. But if we hold it in the larger sense, and say that all are diverse, and given the history in the United States, these groups, people of color, disenfranchised groups historically, are the groups that we need to actually formulate programs to certainly highlight what we bring to organizations, while simultaneously, with our white counterparts, teaching skills to certainly acknowledge what some of those differences are.
What have you seen to be some of the major shifts in the past decade with regard to diversity initiatives?
I would certainly say that some of the shifts have been around how we even think about diversity and inclusion. So I think early on it was around awareness building. And once the awareness sessions happened or those workshops happened, people took that binder, put it on their shelves, and went back to business as usual. At present, what I'm seeing is not only are people going through awareness building, but also introspection around what are some of the biases that I hold that actually limit me from seeing others' full potential or even tapping into my own full potential because of some of the organizational dynamics that play out.
Ooh, I mean, that must be a little touchy, right? Though, when you're thinking it make people a little uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, this work is not just to check off the box. It's about really understanding what we bring to the table.
And how do you get underneath that with the biases? I mean, is that an assessment-based tool?
I think, well, there are certainly tools out there and instruments to assess those. But I think the real learning comes in relationship. And actually, at Breakthrough Dynamics, that's what we actually look at in terms of the underpinning of both individual and organizational change. The relationships become the incubator, if you will, for learning across differences. So I'll give you an example. Working around biases and really understanding our own personal journeys, we may find that if we're working in those places, we may have more commonalities with people than we actually realize, right? Mm-hmm. And also that there are values that come out of our personal experience that shape how we view individuals or members of diverse groups. So how then do we take those two components and build relationships across different?
Because, you know, you can't fault someone for what their journey has been. If they've never been around individuals of a diverse population, then all of a sudden you get in the workplace and you're coming in with a preconceived set of ideas about what these, you know, this other group of people means, and you're applying meaning to it and drawing conclusions from it. So tapping into that individual biases, I think, is essential. So terrific.
Absolutely. And then I think the next piece, Monique, becomes not only tapping into what the biases are, but how does that manifest in terms of one's behaviors, the next critical piece.
Does anything come to top of mind of maybe any ahas that a client you've worked with has experienced in terms of how their biases have manifested for them?
Absolutely. I think that in many ways, when there are several pieces, when you actually look at the organizational data, and some of the analytics that show where there are bottlenecks, if you will, or people not migrating to senior level positions for various reasons. So that's the hardcore data to see that, for example, there may be a school that has a preference in terms of mobility with an organization. There may be individuals who are expressive in terms of being extroverted or introverted, and you see that as an archetype of leadership. And then you look at some of the gender or racial ethnic data, and how does that manifest within the organization, and looking at those pieces. So there's that piece. And then a new adventure that I say, and I use that term very carefully, because another component of this is actually having talent review sessions where we can actually give feedback to some of the managers around how they're even describing the behaviors of people of color, of women, of some of the emerging talent as well.
And that takes place in a talent review session. How do individuals kind of respond to those review sessions?
So there has to be trust, and there has to be a readiness and a willingness. And I say that coaching that team about what our functions will be within those settings are going to be important, as well as I have a colleague who worked with a major client in Ohio, for example, and really the candor of the consultant and the willingness to be relational and not to shame, but to actually challenge carefully around being able to highlight what some of the patterns are. Are we talking about expressive African-American men and women in comparison to our Euro-American or white colleagues within the organization? How are we talking about how those of Asian descent are showing up in meetings and demonstrating leadership? And the other learning piece becomes, how does that leader expand their bandwidth of what leadership actually looks like, right? And so that's the learning that's happening at the organizational level.
When you think about an organization's and or its leadership, its readiness, its willingness, I would imagine that may be motivated by or driven by the critical mission of this work. How does it affect the bottom line? Do you have quantifiable measures that you can point to in kind of making that case that managing diversity is mission critical for an organization?
Yes, we do. In that, so all of the work that we do is first and foremost, we do research within the organization and about the organization and the industry. And looking at where, for example, if it is a retail organization, where's the buying power of the various populations? How is it manifesting within those different markets? Who is actually representing the organization in those markets? How are we building relationships within those communities to actually get real-time data that actually supports what's going on in those markets? In addition, I have not run into a single organization that is being asked to do more with fewer people. And those leaders, for example, are constantly tapping into the same talent. And there's a whole cadre of untapped talent that exists in the organization that's not being actualized, is not being effectively managed, as well as their opportunities are being lost. And I think the other part that's often humorous and sad to some degree, I would say that, when we say that the organizational culture isn't conducive to quote unquote diversity, well, the organization is actually made up of individuals. So it's about the individual change that changes the culture of the organization.
What are some of the greatest barriers to an organization's ability to leverage diversity?
I think it's multifaceted. Primarily, I think initially it's around some of the blind spots that an organizational culture has in terms of being able to see the value of diversity within an organization. I think many organizational systems assume that, I think there's a great book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So many of the leaders feel as if what got them to their position of leadership and what got the organization into their current position is what will move them into the future. And I'm here to tell you that the landscape has certainly changed and those things won't apply any longer.
Well, and exactly. And as you mentioned, there may be opportunity being left on the table. And in particular for organizations with shareholders, it's their responsibility to ensure that they are leveraging the full scope of their resources.
Precisely. And I also agree that, if we look at the experiences of diverse talent within organizations, if people are having enriching, engaging experiences within the organization, then they're more likely to share that information with their formal and informal networks. I think, which then also create opportunities for the business to create partnerships and also to do additional business as well. So the internal experience impacts the external outcomes also.
Mm-hmm. That's a terrific point. I hadn't really thought about that, but you almost, in a way, your current employee base kind of becomes your ambassadors and may be a good channel to other top talent who would desire to work there because it's a desirable workplace.
It's a desirable workplace. And if I feel valued, then I want those that I know to also come and join my organization because they too will experience this positive experience that I'm having. Mm-hmm. So key is that if people are not happy, in the organizational development arena, we've often said people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. So if that leader or that manager or that supervisor is not culturally competent and sees having diversity and inclusion competencies as a leadership ability, then I think there's a loss of talent and a loss of business consequence.
Mm-hmm. I love that term, culturally competent, which really kind of takes me to my next question in terms of what are the key steps in creating a culture to really discuss, embrace these differences that are posed by the diversity advancement.
Wow, that's often the challenge. And I think understanding the culture and what the culture has espoused and what they value is certainly addressed that arena. I think another place is really to look at those relationships. I've come back to that multiple times, and I think it's relationships on multiple fronts. Because if my supervisor knows who I am, then I have mentors within the organization who can help me to navigate through the organization. I think that's another way of doing that. And also sponsorship at the individual level, making sure that there's someone in the space who's willing to advocate on my behalf. But in order to have mentors or sponsors or even a manager who can relate to me, I have to be willing to show up more fully. And let me what I mean by that. Inherently, in some of us, some people of color, we have a distrust of systems. And I think if we can allow ourselves to test the boundary of the organization to say, how much and how far can I show up, and being able to test the waters around that. Simultaneously, I feel that our white colleagues have to be able to expand their bandwidth to meet professionals of color on their turf. And what I mean by that is being able to reach out and experience what I, as an African American, for example, what my life is like, and look at the ways in which actually there may be similarities, and the differences are uniquenesses in terms of negatives, right? So I think there are two ways in which we're co-creating this new dynamic that exists. Also, so that's at the individual interpersonal level, I think the organization has to certainly create avenues for conversations to happen.
And how do they go about doing that? Right. How do they go about creating those avenues? Are those like the affinity groups are given through meeting?
Yes, affinity groups is certainly one way to do that. And having groups where people can have opportunities to dialogue about the organization, about their individual experience, and how that certainly impacts the organization. One of the things that I think has been really effective has been creating diversity partners within the organization. That is to say, leaders who can come together to talk about their own diversity and also how it may be influencing, their decisions may be influencing the organization. I think something else that happens, Monique, is for professionals of color becoming skillful at articulating where it is we want to go and how we want to get there, and getting feedback from those leaders and managers in terms of how we navigate those systems to get the skills that we need.
Exactly. That's a constant part of conversation I often have with clients. It's that, are you articulating where it is that you want to go and solicit support in getting there?
Yes, because how can a manager know what we want if we haven't certainly articulated those parts of what those aspirations?
Absolutely. And oftentimes, I know from my experience in corporate and what I often hear from clients, if you are a minority working in a majority organization of majority whites, that oftentimes there's a feeling of isolation and feeling kind of alone or, in your own little place because others don't understand. And to the word you used, I don't think leaders have done a good job in co-creating a situation. They haven't made others kind of feel welcomed to open up dialogue such that anyone else can offer assistance. So there is a responsibility on every individual's part.
I was working within an organization, I have to tell you the story, and, we talked about building relationships, and this really sharp young African-American male said, I have relationships with those leaders. They know who I am. They speak to me by name as we're walking through the organization. So what more is needed? Do I need to invite them to my house for a barbecue? Do I need to ask them, do they want to walk my dog? I mean, he said, what more do I need to do, And I think that really lends itself to being intentional about what does a strategic career stewardship-oriented conversation look like. And really gaining some skills and nuances around that.
Yeah, because I guess in response to that question, I would say, yeah, it would be. Come on over for a barbecue or come help my dog. If it would help to take your relationship to a different level, maybe.
Absolutely.
Meeting out at the dog park, it would take down some of the, fabricated walls that individuals have in their minds when they're inside of the workplace.
Sure.
Such to allow room for expanding on possibilities of a relationship. So don't rule it out.
Don't rule it out is right. I think the biggest point is, and when I say grace, this is what I mean, that in having relationships across difference, there are going to be mishaps, misunderstandings, and missteps that happen. And having the grace, I think, to be able to manage those in a healthy way that can still be relationship building. I think that's really important.
And what I think I hear you saying is instead of just getting instantly on the defense, and making assumptions about someone's intention, as opposed to it was a misstep.
It was
and
a
maybe
misstep.
And maybe having dialogue to help one understand how maybe there is another way that could be viewed. What was just said.
Precisely. Exactly.
And so that's how you co-create that space.
Yes. And then I think that's how organizations shift. So we have the educational component, the individual component, and then looking at the practices and procedures and policies that actually encourage and support inclusion. I think that's how organizations change.
When you think of diverse leaders, what are some of the unwritten rules for advancement and success for minority leaders that, really may not fairly exist for, let's say, their white counterparts?
Well, there's definitely our rules that certainly exist. And I think having mentors and sponsors to certainly help to navigate through those myriad of dynamics within organizations really becomes, a touchstone in terms of what are some of the written rules and unwritten rules that may not be as obvious, but yet make a difference in terms of how minority leaders or professionals of color move throughout the organization, and particularly move throughout the hierarchy of the organization as well. Another aspect, and I'm going to rely on a colleague of mine, Danny Monroe, has written a book called Untapped Talent. And in her book, Untapped Talent, it refers to three aspects that we as professionals of color bring to our work, and it's resourcefulness, resilience, and resolve. And a part of tapping into those three R's of leadership is understanding our personal journeys and our personal stories, and really seeing the strength that materialize through our story. For example, I think about myself. I am, on my dad's side of my family, I have at least 28 plus first cousins. And on my mom's side of the family, that's a lot, right?
Wow.
And then on my mom's side of the family, I'm one of 12. I have, some 30 first cousins. And therefore, I always grew up as a part of a group. And I knew that my identity was group oriented. Well, isn't that something that organizations look for today in terms of knowing how to navigate through groups, knowing how to speak up in a group, knowing how to pay attention to group dynamics? That was also another part of growing up in a large family structure.
Right.
And therefore, that becomes a resource for me in terms of my organizational experience, to realize that some of the barriers that we've had, or some of the obstacles that we've had, that we've overcome, have actually taught us lessons that help us survive within our organizations, and seeing that as a source of resilience. And then the resolve that comes with, hey, I have overcome those components, and how do I leverage those aspects of who I am to certainly be successful within my organizational life.
Oh, I think that's terrific. And you said, and what was your colleague's name that you referenced, of Untapped Talent?
Sure. Her name is Danny Monroe, D-A-N-I, Monroe, M-O-N-R-O-E. And I tell you that and I love that she came up with the language to actually describe what those aspects of strength and leadership that we bring. Because although our organizations may not tap into those aspects of who we are at a cultural level, at the individual level, that's what I believe helps us to be successful within our organizational life.
And I think that's interesting because that can also be parlayed on how our journey has allowed each of us to be even successful in whatever endeavors in the workplace or outside that we choose to pursue. So I think that's a terrific kind of way of framing how one's experience helps to shape their own, intentions around their advancement and success in the workplace.
Yes. And these are rich stories in terms of hearing about or being aware of your family's migration. I think about my own grandparents and their migration from the south to the north, and why were they migrating? And then how does that migration story impact my journey now? Because, within my family, I was the first to pursue a PhD and doing that trailblazing that my grandparents had done in terms of their journeys. And what can I learn from the family narrative about how to navigate the systems that I operate in? Right. I'm also the first in my family to become an organizational development consultant. And finding out how do I arrive in an organization in a way that honors who I am, my story, and allows me to be successful in those contexts.
Mm-hmm. And so along that line or along that thinking of, an individual's journey stories, is that kind of what serves as the foundation of cultures, organizational cultures? Because if in fact the organization is made up of one particular group or another, it kind of takes on that identity of those individuals.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Many of the organizations that we operate in, they were started by someone's story, right? We're still seeing many professionals of color who are first generation working in corporate America. First generation going off to college. So there's a lot that we may carry in terms of responsibility, in terms of realizing, on some level, because organizational cultures have not shifted, that I, as an African American, for example, represent to the organization other African Americans. So being very mindful of that. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, I feel as if my work is to support the organization in realizing the complexity of, yes, you may have African American male employees or Latino male employees or Latina or Asian women, but there are also individuals who represent individual cultures and have individual strengths. So really expanding the organization's capacity for complexity of who we are as people of color.
And you know how this really resonates with me, what you're saying, and as I think about oftentimes, and speaking on behalf of women, I've heard it being said, well, it's hard to build relationships with them in the workplace. They have a way of connecting out on the golf course and what have you, because sometimes you need to take the conversation out of the brick and mortar of the organization and be in maybe more social environment to kind of bring down the walls and allow for rich conversations. Well, this, as you have shared, and gives kind of this is something to talk about. This is something that, when given time and space, sharing your own personal journey, your family's story, helps to eliminate or minimize the differences between us.
And I would offer as well that, making sure that it's a mutual exchange because, we want to have safety, right? So if I'm sharing about myself, having inquiry to share, ask others about themselves so that it's actually an exchange, it's conversational. And to realize that there may be some degree of vulnerability on both parts to actually have that relationship become more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Terrific point. What does the future hold for the advancement of diversity and organizational effectiveness? What are you seeing out there that individuals should be made aware of?
For the most part, I think it's captured in a very simple phrase, which is change or die. Either organizations respond to the diversity of their workforce, their internal workforce, and creating organizational spaces where people can thrive, where every single employee who crosses the threshold into that organization has the opportunity to thrive, and then that therefore manifests in terms of the deliverables in the external marketplace. for me, it's very, very simple. The challenge becomes first seeing the necessity, two, changing behavior, and three, actually organizations walking their talk in terms of saying they want it, but being willing to change to get it so that they can meet their organizational objectives.
Well, and I love that quote, the change or die. In fact, even as we speak, the numbers are slowly shifting. I think I've used the term majority to refer to our Anglo brethren, but let me tell you, the majority is soon going to be people of color.
Precisely. Yes. And so how do we acknowledge the uniquenesses that people are bringing to the workplace?
To achieve the results of delivering in the marketplace and making sure that you're not leaving anything on the table, but instead embracing and expanding that which is in your resource wheelhouse. Yes. Instead of stifling it, allow it to grow and flourish. So I love that. Well, do you have any closing points?
Yes, I lend myself to really think about the co-creation of organizations and how, it's a collective effort. And the more we risk to show up and organizations are ready to hear what we have to say, I think there are greater opportunities for collaboration, creativity, and innovation. And so, to me, those are words that energize me.
Absolutely.
Words that inspire me to wake up to want to go to work because of the innovative opportunities, and to realize there are also going to be rubs along the way, but the organization has a context where some of those bumps in the road across differences can actually be learning opportunities for growth and development.
If the organization you currently work for falls short of being an inclusive culture and is undermining your potential for success, then I say consider your choices. One choice is just stay the course. You may feel that you've developed the ability to be successful in the workplace despite the corporate culture, and that culture is not going to tarnish the greatness within you. Or choice number two, be part of the solution. Identify ways to ignite that conversation for change toward a more inclusive environment. Or choice three, activate what I call your LeBron James strategy. Similar to what he did in that 2010 ESPN special called The Decision, he announced to the world, as you may recall, that he was taking his talents to South Beach in pursuit of a championship ring. Now, I don't advocate that you grab airtime to make the reveal of your decision. What I do propose is that you wholeheartedly stand in your confidence that you have skills, talents, and deserve to work at a place that sets you up for success. Now for Coach Mo Knows, a tip, coaching question, and a bit of inspiration. My tip is to jumpstart your own thinking about hidden biases on a range of areas, including racial bias, gender, religion, skin tones, sexuality, by completing an implicit association test, otherwise known as an IAT, at Project Implicit. It's a collaborative research effort by the researchers at Harvard University, University of Virginia, and University of Washington. Be sure to visit the show notes for today's podcast, and I'll have a link to the Project Implicit for you to learn more and consider for yourself taking an IAT. My coaching question for you is, how has your career advancement been affected by microaggressions you may have experienced in the workplace? And for inspiration, it comes from Daniel Goleman, internationally known psychologist who's an author and science journalist. And as you consider the dynamics in a workplace environment, consider this quote. What counts in making a happy relationship is not so much how compatible you are, but how you deal with incompatibility. Send me an email at askcoachmo@gmail.com with your workplace dilemma by end of day Friday, and I'll send you a video reply by the following Tuesday. Until then, please subscribe to Tuesdays with Coach Mo podcast to make sure you receive each and every biweekly episode, and leave a review. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time. That's a wrap for this episode of Tuesdays with Coach Mo. Showing up here tells me you're willing to invest in yourself and your career. Get additional resources at tuesdayswithcoachmo.com. Please subscribe and leave a review. I'd love to get your feedback. Till next time, this is Coach Mo signing off.
Tuesdays with Coach Mo.